Saigon, and flew probably half our missions in the south and the other half in the north. But in watching these plane talks through the years, I know you like to know a little bit about the person who's standing up here talking, so I'll just take a few minutes and do that for you. I grew up in South Dakota, and I grew up during the war. And anybody that grew up during the war, of course, the war ended up shaping their lives. And no, I wasn't old enough to make the scene in the military during the war, but I sometimes feel as though I did, because the culture in this country at that time was so war-oriented that it's fun for me to kind of sit back and look at what we did then, and now we say we're in a full-blown war, and I think, well, let's see. I wonder how our culture would handle a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, a national 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. I don't think we're ready for that. I don't think we're ready to give up sugar. I don't think we're ready to gather up all the loose aluminum in the backyard and put it on the corner of the block so it can be picked up and melted down and turned into airplanes. There wasn't any shortage of beer. But there were a few other shortages, I guess, that I don't recall too well. But anyhow, it's kind of fun to compare that era to where we are now. But who knows? Things may tighten up a bit before we get out of this fray. I went off to school for a few years, University of Denver, and the Korean War came along, and I got involved in the Korean War, and it took me 36 years to get out of the Air Force after enrolling in 1951. Went through pilot training and went to the Far Eastern Theater in early in 1953 as the war was winding down, but I went to Okinawa and flew F-94Bs in that time. That was an interceptor version of the T-33, and came back from there and had about 10 years in the Air Defense Command, and flew a lot of the different airplanes that the Air Defense Command had during that era. And then got into tactical reconnaissance and started out flying the RB-66 in Europe, and came back to the States, checked out in the RF-4, and went to Vietnam in late 66, went to Vietnam in late 66. December 7th is the day I stepped off the airplane in Saigon. I thought that was kind of prophetic. Just a good day to start a war. And stayed there through 67 until I had a mission count that rotated me back to the States in 1967, in October 1967. So anyhow, I got to draw you a little map here. I've kind of forgotten what Vietnam looked like, so I think it went something like that, and something like that. And down here was Saigon and the Delta area, and the DMZ was through here. North Vietnam went up there, something like that. And we had quite a few bases over here in Thailand, and we had about 70 recce airplanes down here in Saigon. We had Cam Ranh Bay, and we had Da Nang, and we had Pleiku. So does that look like Vietnam?
Close enough.
It does. Okay, you know better than I. You want this thing. But I flew all of my missions down here, and the RF-4 was a pretty well-equipped reconnaissance airplane for its day, and it had side-looking radar that had very poor resolution. I think the resolution on the side-looking radar was about 1 to 20 feet. So if you were out here in the jungle someplace trying to take side-looking radar pictures of trucks, you wouldn't see them because the resolution wasn't that good. On the other hand, it was pretty good up here in the Haiphong area, and we fly our missions just off the coast up there with a side-looking radar, and we do a pretty good job of picking up ships. So you could count the ships in Haiphong Harbor, and you could keep track of some of the night ship traffic out in the Gulf that wasn't friendly. And then we had a wide array of optical sensors, and we had a camera that sat in the center line of the airplane that as the film went across the shutter, there was a prism that actually took a picture from one horizon to the other. So as you were flying like this, you had this whole area underneath you, 180 degrees, that you were photographing. It had a very short focal length, I think it was 3 inches. So again, the resolution wasn't great, but it was really as good as you could find in the era. Then we had the standard longer focal length cameras that you could put in there, either straight down, forward obliques. You could sort of put splits in to give you more coverage. And when you had split cameras in that were shooting this way out the bottom of the airplane, you were getting about a 40% overlap, which gave the photo interpreters who looked at that product the chance to really get a third dimension. So it was very effective photography to gain a third dimension look at whatever you had taken a picture of. And then one of our primary cameras was an infrared camera. It was vertical, and it did a great job in the jungle picking up campfires. And we spent a lot of time taking pictures in the jungle looking for campfires. We as crew members didn't see a lot of the product unless we wanted to go into the photo interpreter's operation and watch them sit there and go over this seemingly blank film until they'd see little spots down there. And it was that basic element of intelligence that would get fed into the intelligence system, and would eventually, given that you had those fire returns in the same place night after night after night, the Army would usually go in and see what was going on. But it was a pretty effective camera to build our intelligence base in Vietnam. Now, we had at Saigon a wing, a reconnaissance wing that had 2 RF-4C squadrons, 2 RF-101 squadrons, which were day only, 1 RB-57 squadron, and 2 C-47 squadrons that were equipped to listen. In other words, there were linguists on board who listened to the conversations of the bad guys in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam. So you picked up communications, and again, that was just more information that fed into the overall database for the war effort down there. When we first reported in as crew members over there, then as a pilot, we'd get teamed up with an experienced backseater. At that time, we had young second lieutenant, first lieutenant pilots in the back seat, and they were really unhappy campers because they felt as though they hadn't signed up to sit in the back seat of an RF-4 and go to war. They all felt as though they needed to be in the front seat, but that was the program that was in existence at the time. We called them pilot system operators, or GIBs, guys in the back. And in reality, it really wasn't a bad place for a young pilot to learn how to fly, because most of us let those kids in the back get an awful lot of flying time, and there were probably a number of them who would have come home in a box had they not had the opportunity to fly with somebody more experienced in that combat situation. But anyhow, so as a new guy in the front, I had an old head guy in the back, And we would always start flying missions as new guys down here in the Delta area, south of Saigon. And those missions would usually be these infrared area covers. And if we had a target area like that, then we would we'd draw up these flight lines. And a flight line would, in essence, give you the coverage from this area over to that area, and then you'd come down and get on a different flight line. So you might start out this mission up here and fly this line, and then come around, fly this line, and then come around, fly this line, and plowshare your way down, and eventually go out and come out in something like that. And I think it was probably the second or third one of these things that I was doing down the Delta. It was pretty harmless down there. It's flat as this floor, and it was the Mekong Delta. The Mekong River, forgot my geography, but it dumped someplace down in here into the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was just flat country and rice paddies, and that was it. So I think it was on the second or third mission, and I was going through one of these plowshare operations, and someplace on the south end of this mission, there was a gun. And of course the backseater was engrossed in his radar, and he's trying to keep me on this flight pattern. And I noticed that as we worked our way along in one direction, plowsharing, that this gun would shoot at us, and it was at night. And of course I don't know how the tracers were belted, but you know, we used to think of every 10 or 12 rounds would be a tracer. So I watched this guy work us over, and we'd go down, and then we'd make this turn, and as we'd go down, why, these tracers would come in over the airplane, and first time in my life I'd ever seen that. I thought it was kind of pretty, and it was. And so I did this for about 3 times, and he was working out the lead problem pretty nicely, and I realized that. So I called the guy in the back, and I said, have you seen this gun working us over down there? No. So he came out, and he had about 6 or 7 4-letter words that came out of his mouth, and he said, it all amounted to, let's get out of here. I said, well, okay. So we left, and we went back to that area probably 3 times in the next week, and the same gun was there, and we'd report the gun, and it was always there every night. But it was kind of an easy way to get indoctrinated to flag. And as we started flying missions up north, of course, those were different kind of missions. But one of our average missions up north, that line I've just drawn on there is a river called the Quan Key River, and where that river up there comes out of Vietnam and into Laos. That's Laos. That's an L. Is Magia Pass, and for those of you who know anything, you know, I've listened to some of these Vietnam people talk about their war down there. A lot of the activity on the Ho Chi Minh Trail came down through what's called Magia Pass. Right there. So a lot of our missions out of Saigon would be to come out of Saigon, go out over the Gulf, and go up that river, turn down Magia Pass, and usually hit a target in Laos. There were some large bivouac areas down there where the people would hole up in the day. At night there was a lot of activity on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So there was a lot of, the night is when we flew our missions up in there, and we would often see lights, and as we evolved along in the war in 1967, which was probably the heaviest part of the air war in Vietnam. 67 is when we were losing about 25 airplanes a month in the north and a lot more choppers in the south. Then we would, a lot of different tactics evolved. And when the people in Saigon who were running the war realized that the reconnaissance airplanes operating at night were encountering a lot of activity and simply reporting it, but unable to do anything about it on the scene, then they decided to team up fighters and recce airplanes. And I happened to be the first person who got experimented with on one of these missions. I flew into Da Nang one night, late one, well, it was early one evening, right there, and I was to team up with two F-4s loaded with CBUs, and CBUs are these little bomblet things that they're still, you know, you're hearing about them in Afghanistan these days. But the CBUs were used primarily over there against gun positions. So the idea was to get the reconnaissance airplane through to troll and cause the guns to come up and go to work, and then these two fighters that were trailing along behind you were supposed to hit the gun positions with the CBUs. So I checked into the command post at Da Nang with my backseater, and I met the two crews, the two fighter crews who were going to accompany us on this mission. And we went through a briefing, and I noticed a really clear lack of enthusiasm on the part of these two fighter guys. First of all, I don't think they were crazy about doing anything low level at night, and they didn't like the idea of teaming up with a reconnaissance airplane or crew. They just didn't care for us too much. They thought we were second-class citizens. So, and that's the old fighter mentality. You all know a little bit about that. So anyhow, we went through this briefing, and we were going to take off from Da Nang, come out here, get down to about 1,500 feet, and follow the river up and go down through Magia Pass, and we were going to come home back to Saigon, and they were going to hit targets of opportunity up there at the downside, south end of Magia Pass. So we did. We all went out and started up our airplanes, and one of the fighters couldn't get his engines going. So we sat there for an hour with our engine running, as did the other fighter, waiting for this guy to change airplanes. And so he finally got in a spare and finally got cranked up. And we took off, and we went out over the Gulf of Tonkin and started our descent down into the mouth of the Quan Key River and went through a cloud deck. And when we went, it was at night, you couldn't see the cloud deck. You didn't know you were in the cloud deck until you were in the clouds, and your lights started flashing back at you. So we went through the cloud deck, and pretty soon I heard a call, and I used my call sign and said, "Where are you?" And I thought, well, this is probably the beginning of the end of this mission. And so I reported where I was in general terms, and they said, "Okay, well, we'll see if we can pick you up on our radar." So I went up the Quan Key River, and I continued to hear these calls, and I could hear the two fighter guys talking between each other, and they said, "We really don't want to go up that river, do we?" And one of the guys said, "No, we don't want to go up that river." So we went on up to the Magia Pass, and we turned south to the Magia Pass, and you always got a lot of flak activity on the Magia Pass too. So we went through all of that. So these guys, now probably 30 minutes after takeoff, and they called, wondered where we were, and said, "Well, we're exiting the Magia Pass." "Oh well, we'll find you." So we climbed out, and we listened to these guys talking to each other for about 10 or 15 minutes trying to find us, and finally we called up and said, "Well, we're on our way back to Saigon." Now, I don't want to imply by any stretch of the imagination that there wasn't a lot of professionalism in that mission, because because there really was, even though they weren't enthusiastic about being part of it. But it was one of those tactics that evolved, and it was never tried again. It just was, that was something that just wasn't going to work. The Recce guys didn't like the idea of trolling for flak. They'd rather go in there by themselves and not be bothered with somebody else in the flight, because that was our culture. The fighter culture was gang up, flights 2, and go after targets. But it was, you know, just a sidelight on how we did business in those days. What was the reconnaissance contribution to the war effort? I think we did pretty good work based on the equipment that we had. I used to spend a lot of time in the intelligence centers trying to understand how the data was used that we brought back, and it was correlated with other human intelligence, and it was correlated with other electronic intelligence, and with other, they called it communications intelligence. And these fusion centers were really pretty good and pretty effective, but one of the biggest drawbacks to feeding that intelligence into the operational area was poor. The information just didn't get, that was all fused into the intelligence community and very well protected by the intelligence community, was not fed back into the operational community very well. So in many cases, the fighter wings over there that needed the data that we were assembling often didn't get that data. And I can just move a little bit deeper into that subject. After I left Vietnam, I went to Japan, and I was in one of these fusion centers up in Japan, intelligence fusion centers. And in October, I think it was, no, it wasn't either. It was early in 1968 that we lost the Pueblo. And that was an intelligence vessel that the North Koreans went out, boarded, and took, and held the crew in captivity for a while. And the intelligence community, through their communications intelligence and their electronic intelligence, knew exactly what was going on with the Pueblo from the time that the North Vietnamese went after it. But that information was never bled into the operational community. So after that, there was a very concerted effort to change that. And I was a project officer on building one of these fusion centers on the operational side of the fence, so to speak. I hope I'm not... Anyhow, so we set up this little center at 5th Air Force up in Japan. And we were augmented with some additional people to help us. They were reconnaissance people, to help us create this center. And we went into operation on April 15th, 1969. That was the day that the North Vietnamese shot down a Navy EC-121. And the very first piece of information that came to us through the intelligence center into this operational fusion center was the conversation that was going on between the North Vietnamese air defense people, or not air defense people, but air control people, and their fighters who went up to shoot it down. We listened to that whole thing, and we scrambled fighters, but it was too late. The North Vietnamese ran out a pair of MiG-21s, and one was low and one was high, So radar-wise, they only really saw one airplane. And the North Vietnamese then turned the flight back. But they really only turned that top airplane came back. The bottom plane came up and shot down the 121. We listened to that whole thing, scrambled fighters out of Korea when it was too late. But that was the start of the operational and intelligence fusion centers that have grown into a pretty effective force today as we speak. Well, I've done a lot of rambling here, but Deloy, well, I've only used 30 minutes of your time, but that's about it unless somebody wants to talk about this stuff. Go ahead.
I had a couple questions. Number one, did you not carry any munitions at all on your aircraft?
No, we didn't. But a little bit later in the war, they put AIM-9s on RF-4s. In fact, the RF-4 we have outside here has AIM-9 missiles. It's been a long-running battle between within the operational community, whether or not it's wise to arm reconnaissance fighter-type airplanes. And for years, the argument that said, you really don't want to arm those airplanes because you don't want those guys to go out there and get involved in things that are not intelligence gathering kinds of activity. In other words, you don't want them to go out there and start a small war with the armament that you've given them. You just want them to go out, gather intelligence, and come home. That argument has always prevailed until later in the Vietnam War when they put AIM-9s on F-4s. But I don't think that a RF-4 ever fired a shot in anger. So I don't think they were ever used. The AIM-9 missiles, that is.
You kept up on the development of new camera and radar systems? And how
No.
does it compare with what we got now?
No, not very well, because the resolution has just gotten better and better and better. So good, in fact, that you can take pictures from satellites now that is probably better than anything that ever came out of an airplane. So, in general terms, yes. Specifically, no. I don't know what the resolution is on those satellite cameras, but we all read Newsweek, and they're probably accurate.
What was your duration time limit, as far as each flight?
About 2.5 hours. Yeah. We used to have some 6 and 7 hour missions where we'd leave Saigon and go up over just south of Magia Pass and cycle off a tanker. And then we'd just orbit Magia Pass all night long. We'd keep an airplane over there all night. And so if you saw lights or any kind of activity down there, you'd go down and make a photo run on it. Again, that was a tactic that lasted for about a month or two, and those are really nasty missions. And we just didn't really have to do that.